The classroom was silent except for the soft hum of alien technology buzzing around the sleek walls. The Galactic University of Zalthor was a hub of intellect, where beings from across the universe came to sharpen their diplomatic skills. At the front, Professor Zorath, a towering and highly respected alien with sleek, obsidian-black skin, paced around the room with a look of utter confidence. He had taught for centuries, seen countless species, and brokered peace across the galaxy. There was no doubt in his mind. He was the most intellectually advanced being here. His eyes fell upon James Carter, the lone human in a room full of insectoid scholars, towering reptilians, and humanoid aliens. James was an anomaly sent from Earth, a Deathworlder where every day was a struggle for survival. Humans, to Zorath, were a primitive species, reckless, emotional, and, in his opinion, incapable of truly understanding galactic diplomacy. Zorath had no respect for humanity, and this was his chance to prove it. Zorath smirked, fixing his gaze on James. "Mr. Carter, would you like to enlighten the class on how you believe humans can contribute to the delicate art of diplomacy?" Zorath's voice was rich with condescension, and his sharp claws gently tapped the table, emphasizing his superiority. The other students snickered. Humans were often the subject of jokes in the galaxy, known more for their military aggression than their diplomatic acumen. But James Carter, despite being ridiculed, did not flinch. He stood there, unblinking, his steel blue eyes locked onto the professor's gaze. His hand rested casually on the hilt of his sword, hidden beneath his cloak, a symbol of Earth's violent past. But there was something more about James than met the eye. He wasn't just the human student. He was a survivor. And today, Zorath would learn that underestimating humans was a grave mistake. The tension in the room grew thicker. Zorath's arrogance was palpable, but James didn't need words to respond. His silence spoke volumes, and everyone in the room felt it, the calm before the storm. Zorath would soon realize that humanity's power wasn't in their intellect, but in something far more primal. And before this class was over, Zorath's arrogance would be shattered in the most unexpected way. The Galactic University of Zalthor was a prestigious institution, revered across the universe as the epicenter of knowledge and diplomacy. Its campus stretched across vast crystalline structures, suspended in midair, held together by the hum of anti-gravity fields. Alien species from all corners of the galaxy attended this university, each hoping to master the delicate art of diplomacy, an essential skill in a galaxy constantly teetering on the edge of war. Professor Zorath was the shining star of the university, a being whose reputation spanned millennia. He had settled disputes between empires, forged alliances with species known for their ruthlessness, and brokered peace across the galaxy. His intellect was unparalleled, his diplomatic skills legendary, and his arrogance almost as vast as the galaxies he traversed. He believed firmly that diplomacy was a game of power, of subtlety, intellect, and strategy. Words, carefully chosen, were mightier than any weapon in his hands. For him, the universe was a chessboard, and he was the grandmaster. In his mind, humans were nothing but an outlier in this cosmic web of sophistication. Primitive, aggressive, and emotional, they had nothing to offer but brute force. Their existence, as far as he was concerned, was little more than a footnote in the grand scheme of galactic affairs. Humanity, in his eyes, was a species forever destined to struggle at the bottom of the intellectual ladder. Zorath had seen countless races rise and fall, but humans had never been able to grasp the subtle intricacies of diplomacy or intergalactic peace. Their efforts had always been tainted by their primal instincts. That was until James Carter walked into his class. A lone human among an elite group of alien students, James had been sent to Zalthor University as part of a diplomatic mission from Earth. The Galactic Council had chosen him, believing that perhaps, just perhaps, humanity might one day play a role in the greater galactic community. James, however, didn't seem to fit the mold of a diplomat. James Carter was no scholar, no soft-spoken negotiator. He was a soldier, trained to fight and survive on a death world, Earth, where every living thing was a predator, and survival was earned through strength, adaptability, and sheer willpower. He had seen things that no alien race could ever imagine. The brutality of Earth's wild environments, the chaos of human warfare, and the depths of human resilience. To him, diplomacy wasn't about words, it was about survival and the ability to hold your ground when the universe tries to crush you. At the university, James felt like an outsider. The alien students, many of whom came from highly evolved, technologically advanced worlds, often looked at him with dismissive eyes. Some whispered about humans being too emotional or too aggressive for the subtleties of galactic diplomacy. Zorath, the professor, was the most vocal in his doubts. He often mocked James, throwing him into discussions about complex political theories and offering him scenarios that seemed specifically designed to show just how underprepared humanity was for the intricacies of galactic relations. The rest of the class, aliens from species with long histories of diplomacy, watched James with a mixture of amusement and condescension. They laughed quietly behind their hands, assuming the human would inevitably stumble. But James remained silent, observing, waiting, and never once letting their ridicule get under his skin. He understood something they didn't. The stakes were higher than just words. This wasn't a game to him. This was life and death. Professor Zorath's ego, swollen by centuries of success, had become a weapon in itself. He saw himself as the galaxy's unquestionable authority on diplomacy, holding the power to shape the destinies of entire species. And as he looked at the humans sitting in the back of the class, his thoughts were clear. James Carter would never measure up. The professor decided to test James. He presented him with a complex scenario, an issue involving a hostile alien species, one that had been at the brink of war for centuries. The assignment was designed to test not only the students' understanding of diplomacy, but their capacity for subtlety and tact. Zorath was sure that James would fail. He would stumble over the details, misinterpret the cultural complexities, and most importantly, show that humans simply didn't understand the nuanced nature of galactic politics. What Zorath didn't know was that he was about to make a grave mistake. James Carter wasn't here to play their game. He wasn't here to just make peace with words. He was here to survive. And if survival required fighting, adapting, or showing the galaxy what humanity was truly capable of, James would be ready. The moment Zorath's arrogance flared, James would draw his sword, and in doing so he would show that sometimes diplomacy wasn't about words, it was about actions. And Professor Zorath would soon regret underestimating a Deathworlder. The tension in the classroom was palpable as Professor Zorath turned his cold, calculating eyes toward James Carter, the lone human among a sea of alien intellects. The professor had grown tired of the quiet mockery, the whispers from the alien students who had already written off humanity as primitive and unfit for diplomacy. Zorath's mind raced with one unspoken thought: this human would fail. With an air of quiet authority, Zorath set the stage. "Mr. Carter, I have a scenario for you," Zorath began, his voice dripping with a mix of curiosity and arrogance. "You've been tasked with negotiating a peace treaty between two species that have been at war for centuries. One that is highly intellectual and diplomatic, the other, a brutal warrior race that values only strength. How would you, a human, handle such delicate negotiations?" The question was loaded. Zorath knew the human tendency toward aggression, their inability to grasp the fine art of subtlety. He had designed the scenario to challenge not only James's understanding of diplomacy, but his ability to think beyond his primal instincts. James stood still, his eyes locking onto the professor with a quiet intensity. There was a calmness in his demeanor, an inner strength that Zorath had mistaken for weakness. The class shifted uncomfortably, expecting the typical impulsive human reaction. James's reputation as a soldier, someone who had seen combat and survived the deadliest environments on Earth, was well known. And yet, here he was, standing silently, waiting for the moment when Zorath would inevitably expose his failure. "Well," Zorath pressed, his patience wearing thin. "Answer, Mr. Carter. Or perhaps your species cannot fathom such a scenario." James's lips curled into the faintest of smirks. For a moment, It seemed as though he might not respond at all, but instead he stepped forward, his voice calm, but his words cutting through the silence with startling precision. Diplomacy isn't about speaking the right words. It's about knowing when to use the right ones, and when to make your position clear. Zorath's eyes narrowed, his arrogance flaring again. "A human would choose violence, wouldn't you?" he asked, his tone mocking. "You think a mere warrior could negotiate peace with brute force?" James remained unfazed, his gaze unwavering. Strength is not just about power. It's about showing that you have the resolve to act when words fail. A true negotiator knows that sometimes you must make your intentions clear, without a hint of weakness. You offer peace, but you also show your ability to defend it. A murmur ran through the class. Zorath's smirk faltered, and for a brief moment, he felt the uncomfortable sensation of doubt creeping in. The human's answer was not only unexpected, but thoughtful in its own way. It wasn't the typical response he had anticipated. Humans, after all, were known for their quick temper and reckless aggression, not their subtlety. And yet, James's words had carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. The professor scoffed, quickly regaining his composure. "You are naive, Mr. Carter. No peace can be brokered with the threat of violence. You would not only fail, you would destroy any chance of lasting peace." James tilted his head slightly, as if considering the professor's words. Then, in a movement so swift it took the room by surprise, he drew his sword, the hum of the blade crackling to life in the tense silence. His calmness remained, but there was something in his posture that now radiated an undeniable presence. He didn't move to attack, but the message was clear. He wasn't a mere diplomat. He was a Deathworlder, and he was ready to prove it. The classroom fell into complete silence, the alien students frozen in place. Professor Zorath's smirk vanished, his arrogance fading. For the first time in years, the professor felt the gnawing realization that he had just made a fatal miscalculation. James Carter was not just a student. He was something far more dangerous. The illusion of control that Zorath had once held in the classroom had shattered with a single, deliberate action. The human wasn't here to play by the rules of diplomacy, as Zorath knew them. James was here to redefine them. And Zorath, arrogant as he was, had unknowingly become part of the lesson. The hum of tension in the room intensified as James Carter stood there, blade drawn, his expression calm and composed. Yet his presence was anything but. Professor Zorath stood opposite him, his gaze narrowing. The arrogance that had initially guided his every word now began to waver. He had dismissed the human, belittled him in front of his peers, and challenged him on a level he had believed humans could never meet. But James had passed that challenge with an unexpected form of strength, a strength that Zorath had grossly underestimated. And now, the professor's pride was in danger. He had built his entire career on his ability to control the room, to manipulate those around him with his superior intellect and quiet command. But this human, this Deathworlder, had refused to bow to that control. His subtlety and calm had begun to undermine everything Zorath believed in. The professor could feel the weight of doubt creeping in, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. He would not let this human embarrass him any further. "Enough of this posturing, Mr. Carter," Zorath said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You think you can solve every problem with brute force, but diplomacy is not a battlefield. You are out of your depth. You think violence is a tool for peace, but you are wrong. There is a way to solve disputes without resorting to threats, and you have failed to understand that." The alien students, who had been watching in stunned silence, now exchanged whispers. Some of them leaned in, eager to see what would happen next. Others, more cautious, took a step back, watching the professor with growing concern. But Zorath, ignoring the mounting tension, pressed on. "If you truly believe you can teach me something, human, prove it," Zorath declared, his voice rising. "I challenge you to a debate, a battle of minds, your approach against mine. I will dismantle your logic, just as I have done to others before you." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown at the feet of the human student. Zorath's eyes were filled with an icy confidence, believing that James would crumble under the intellectual weight of his challenge. After all, Zorath was a master of galactic diplomacy. No student could best him in the art of words. James, still standing silently, didn't move. The tension was almost unbearable, with the entire class now on edge. But he didn't respond in the way Zorath anticipated. James didn't engage in a verbal retort or rise to the bait for a debate. Instead, he simply took a single step forward, his eyes still locked onto Zorath's. The professor, not understanding the gravity of the situation, sneered. "Are you afraid, Mr. Carter? Afraid to match wits with someone far more experienced than you? How typical. A human would rather fight than think." That was the moment Zorath had gone too far. The air shifted, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. James didn't need to speak. His eyes, cold as steel, locked onto Zorath's, and it was in that moment that the alien professor realized his mistake. He had pushed the human too far, and now, it was clear, James had no intention of backing down. The classroom, once filled with the murmur of nervous whispers, was now deathly silent. Zorath's bravado faltered for a split second as he recognized the raw danger in the human's gaze. The quiet power of James's presence was far more intimidating than any threat could ever be. Suddenly, without warning, James swung his sword in a perfect arc. No violence, no aggression, just a swift, calculated motion that sliced through the air with the precision of a master. The glowing blade's hum rang out, resonating through the silent classroom, a symbolic reminder of the human's resolve. Zorath flinched, his heart racing. The sword stopped just inches from his face. It was not a threat of violence, it was a warning. James Carter had made his point. This was not a class to be dominated by intellect alone. Sometimes action spoke louder than words. Zorath's chest tightened as the realization hit him. The human had been quietly observing the entire time, watching, calculating. His silence had been strategic, his calm demeanor a weapon in itself. James Carter wasn't here to win a debate. He was here to show that diplomacy wasn't just about words. It was about will, strength, and knowing when to stand your ground. Zorath opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The weight of his arrogance, the belief that he could control any situation, now felt like a burden, a bitter reminder of his overconfidence. The rest of the class stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They had witnessed the power shift in the room. James Carter had not only met Zorath's challenge, he had completely turned the tables. In that moment, the human student had become the teacher, and the alien professor, once the supreme intellectual, realized he had become the student in this lesson of survival, strength, and humility. James lowered his sword, his eyes still unwavering. The test had been passed. Professor Zorath stood frozen in place, his eyes locked onto the glowing blade just inches from his face. The hum of the sword echoed in the room, sending a chill down his spine. The sharp edge, poised to strike, had come so close it was almost a physical presence in the air. Yet James Carter, the human soldier who had drawn it, made no move to strike. He simply stood there, calm and unyielding, his gaze unwavering. For the first time in his career, Zorath felt vulnerable, something he had never experienced in his long life. He had taught and dealt with countless species, from the most advanced civilizations to the most savage warrior races, but never had he encountered someone like this. A human, a Deathworlder, with a strength and resolve that not only shattered his expectations, but also dismantled his entire worldview. The alien professor took a step back, trying to regain some semblance of control. He attempted to find his footing, to reassert his authority in front of the class. But the shift in power was undeniable. "Mr. Carter," Zorath began, his voice shaky, his usual calm demeanor now replaced by an edge of uncertainty. "This isn't the way to solve diplomatic problems." James's expression remained unchanged, and he didn't speak. Instead, his eyes flickered to the room, to the students who had been so quick to mock him, to the aliens who had laughed at his supposed inferiority. Now, their faces were painted with a mixture of awe and fear. Some had taken a step back, while others were too stunned to move. Zorath, still recovering from his shock, tried to force a smile, but it was a poor mask for his anxiety. A true diplomat must rely on negotiation and intellect, not on physical threats. His voice grew firmer as he tried to regain control. You've made your point, human, but this is not how galactic diplomacy works. James's gaze never wavered. He stood tall, the sword still in hand, but his demeanor was as cool as ever. Zorath thought he had seen the last of the human's challenge, but James hadn't finished his lesson. You're right, Professor, James replied, his voice calm, but with a subtle undercurrent of intensity. Diplomacy is about understanding. It's not just about words, but about knowing when to show your strength. The human approach isn't about manipulating others with subtle words. It's about showing you can stand your ground when the rest of the universe is trying to knock you down. The words landed like a physical blow, and for the first time, Zorath understood. Humans weren't like the other species he had encountered. They didn't just use intellect, political maneuvering, or threats to assert power. They used their entire being, their will to survive, and that was something far more dangerous than any clever diplomatic play. The human had shown him that there was no room for weakness in the face of aggression, no place for subtlety when a show of force was needed. But Zorath wasn't ready to concede yet. His pride, built over centuries of domination, refused to let him admit defeat. You're nothing more than a brute, Mr. Carter, he sneered. Your primitive instincts will get you nowhere in this galaxy. That was the moment Zorath made his final miscalculation. The professor's words were not just a dismissal. They were an invitation for the human to respond. Zorath had underestimated the human's quiet resolve, failing to realize that what James lacked in diplomatic finesse, he more than made up for with a deadly presence and an intuitive grasp of power dynamics. With a swift motion, James raised his sword, not to strike, but to demonstrate just how far he was willing to go. The blade glowed brightly, casting sharp shadows across the room as he turned toward the class. His eyes scanned the faces of the alien students, now filled with a mix of admiration and fear. I didn't come here to prove that I'm more capable of fighting than talking, James said, his voice steady and piercing. I came here to show you that the only way to truly understand diplomacy is to never forget that survival is the foundation of all your negotiations. If you can't survive, none of this matters. Zorath took a step back, but this time there was no mockery, no condescending smile. For the first time in his life, the professor realized the truth in James's words. Diplomacy wasn't just about words, it was about knowing when to stand tall, when to assert your power, and when to make others understand that you wouldn't back down. James's voice softened and his stance relaxed, but the sword remained firmly in his hand, its presence undeniable. I don't need to fight you, Professor. I don't need to prove myself to anyone. But sometimes, you need to let people know that if they push you too far, there will be consequences. Zorath was no fool. He knew when he was defeated. His mind raced as he processed everything that had just happened. The human hadn't just defeated him in combat. He had undermined everything Zorath believed in. This was no longer about diplomacy. This was about something more elemental, something he couldn't control. Humanity's raw strength. Zorath, his pride finally cracking under the weight of the human's calm yet unshakable resolve, lowered his head. You've made your point, Mr. Carter. James nodded, the sword now at his side, his victory complete, not through force, but through the undeniable force of his presence. He hadn't needed to prove his physical dominance. He had simply shown Zorath and the entire class that true power often lies in silence, resilience, and knowing when to stand your ground. The lesson was now clear to everyone in the room. Humans were not to be underestimated. And in that moment, Professor Zorath realized he had just become a student of the very lesson he thought he could teach. The silence in the classroom was deafening. It was as if the entire room had been frozen in time, each being unsure of how to respond to what had just transpired. Professor Zorath, once a towering figure of intellectual superiority, now stood at the center of the room, his thoughts racing as he tried to process the sudden shift in power. The glowing sword in James Carter's hand was still humming softly, its presence undeniable, its message clear. strength in silence. James, standing calmly with his sword at his side, had said nothing since his last words. He didn't need to. The power of his silence spoke volumes, louder than any challenge, louder than any sharp retort. His eyes, steel blue and unwavering, scanned the room, pausing momentarily on each alien student. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no smugness, just quiet confidence and the unspoken knowledge that he had already won this battle. He hadn't needed to argue with Zorath or defeat him in some grand debate. His victory had been achieved with nothing more than his presence, his willingness to stand his ground, to refuse to back down in the face of Zorath's overwhelming intellect and arrogance. Zorath, unable to ignore the weight of his own defeat, glanced at his students. Some were still in shock, their eyes wide and filled with disbelief. Others had begun to whisper amongst themselves, their voices trembling as they tried to process the turn of events. They had come to the university expecting to learn from the best. They had expected Zorath's teachings to be the definitive truth on diplomacy. And yet here they were, in a classroom where the unthinkable had happened. A human had not only stood up to their professor, he had defied their expectations and won. Zorath, for the first time in years, felt a ripple of doubt. He had always prided himself on his ability to control any situation, his ability to outthink his opponents and manipulate situations with the finesse of a master diplomat. But against James Carter, a human, he had failed. He had miscalculated, underestimated, and overlooked the very thing that had made humans so dangerous: their will to survive, their ability to endure, and most importantly, their resilience in the face of adversity. James didn't gloat or taunt the professor. He didn't need to. His quiet strength spoke for itself. In that moment, the room realized the power of being unshakable. Zorath had used words to try to bend reality, to shape outcomes with diplomacy and manipulation. But James had used actions to prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a speech or a cleverly woven argument. It was the ability to remain silent and unmoved when the world around you expected you to fall. The class continued to watch, some in awe, some in fear, but all in a new understanding of humanity. They had witnessed James's calm resolve, his willingness to stand firm even in the face of ridicule, his quiet confidence that didn't rely on words. They had seen that James was not a mere human. He was something else entirely, a survivor, a force of nature, a Deathworlder whose strength lay not just in his body, but in his indomitable spirit. Zorath felt the weight of the lesson pressing down on him. The professor, despite his vast knowledge, had not understood the most essential truth about humanity. Humans were not about diplomatic finesse or intellectual superiority. They were about surviving. They were about adapting. And in this galaxy of endless conflicts, of shifting alliances and subtle games of power, the survival instinct was a power that even the most seasoned diplomats had failed to recognize. James didn't need to debate or dispute Zorath's philosophy. His very existence was enough. His silence, his confidence, his willingness to simply stand there without backing down spoke louder than any words ever could. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Zorath cleared his throat. His pride, though wounded, began to shift, his mind racing as he processed the lessons James had taught him without speaking. The professor swallowed his pride and, for the first time, said something he had never imagined uttering to a human. "You've proven your point, Mr. Carter." James didn't reply. He didn't need to. The lesson had been learned. The battle was over, not because of any grand victory or confrontation, but because Zorath understood. He understood that sometimes the greatest power was the ability to remain silent in the face of overwhelming opposition, to never back down, to never flinch. James nodded, the weight of the moment settling in the room like an unspoken agreement. The alien students were now looking at him, not with disdain, but with respect, some even with a new sense of fear. And Zorath, once so sure of his intellectual dominance, had learned that survival, the true essence of diplomacy, was not about bending others to your will. It was about standing firm, even when everyone expects you to break. In the silence that followed, James Carter didn't need to say a word. He had already shown the entire class exactly what it meant to be human in a galaxy that underestimated humanity at its peril. The silence in the room weighed heavily, each passing second lingering like an eternity. Professor Zorath stood there, his posture still towering, but his aura had shifted. The arrogance that once defined his every word, every gesture, had begun to crumble. The sharpness in his eyes had dulled, replaced by something unfamiliar: respect. For the first time in years, Zorath realized that the battle he had been fighting wasn't one of intellect or rhetoric. It was a battle of will. And in this confrontation, James Carter had shown him just how much the human spirit could endure. Zorath, the master of galactic diplomacy, had just become a student, and the lesson was one he had never anticipated. James, still standing with his blade by his side, had not spoken a word since their last exchange. He hadn't gloated or taunted Zorath, nor had he used his victory as a tool to humiliate the professor. He had simply stood firm, unshaken, unmovable, and for that, Zorath was forced to confront a truth that he could no longer deny. For all his centuries of experience, his endless study of political machinations, and his belief in the power of intellect, Zorath had failed to grasp one simple fact: strength was not solely measured by intellect or diplomacy. There was more to power than just words. Survival, the instinct to persevere when all odds were stacked against you, was a force that Zorath had never fully appreciated, at least not from the human perspective. As the professor stood there, the eyes of the class fixed upon him, he couldn't help but see the shift in their expressions. The alien students, who had once mocked James as a primitive and emotional being, now regarded him with a quiet reverence. Some were even looking to the professor for guidance, unsure of how to process what they had just witnessed. Zorath had always prided himself on being the unquestioned authority in the room, but now he was no longer the figure of invincible wisdom. The weight of human resilience had humbled him in a way that no amount of political victory or intellectual brilliance ever had. Zorath cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had held the room captive. "I have made a mistake, Mr. Carter." His voice was quieter than it had been before, lacking the sharpness that once marked every word. "You have shown me something I did not understand." James didn't respond immediately. His posture was relaxed, his demeanor still and unbothered. It was as if he knew that Zorath's admission of defeat was the only thing left for the professor to give. There was no need for further discussion. The lesson had been imparted not through an argument, but through actions. Zorath continued, his voice softer but genuine. "I have spent my life teaching that diplomacy is the art of intellect and manipulation. I have always believed that control over others, using words and strategy, was the true form of power. But today I see that I was wrong. You've shown me that true power is not in control, but in the ability to endure, to stand firm, no matter what." The professor paused, his eyes falling to the floor for a brief moment. The weight of his arrogance, the years of believing that no one could outthink or outmaneuver him, had now been shattered. James hadn't needed to outsmart Zorath. He hadn't needed to use words or intellectual arguments. All he had done was remain steadfast, remain true to his nature, and that in itself was enough to topple the professor's towering pride. The class was still silent. No one moved, no one dared to speak. They were all witnessing a moment of profound humility, the kind that could only be earned through experience, not theory. Zorath had been brought to a place where his vast knowledge and political acumen were no longer the most important things in the room. The human, the primitive species, had shown him that sometimes words didn't matter. What mattered was the strength to survive, to push through, to hold on in the face of overwhelming odds. James glanced around the room, his eyes meeting the professor's. There was no triumph in his expression, just a quiet understanding. He didn't need to prove anything more. The professor had finally seen the truth, that humanity's strength was not merely in intellect, but in something much deeper, something more unpredictable and indomitable than any alien race could ever understand. "You've learned a valuable lesson, Professor," James said, his tone calm but firm. "Sometimes the best way to survive in a world full of predators is to never back down, no matter how much they think they can break you." The words hung in the air, And for the first time, Zorath understood what James Carter's presence meant. Survival, adaptability, and resilience were not qualities to be underestimated. These were the true strengths of humanity, and they had just rewritten the rules of diplomacy in Zorath's mind. As the class began to stir, murmurs of disbelief and respect filled the room. Zorath slowly nodded, his pride bruised, but his understanding expanded. He would never look at humanity the same way again. In that brief moment of silence, a shift in power had occurred, not just in the classroom, but in the professor's very perception of the galaxy. James Carter, the human, had proven that true strength wasn't in intellect alone. It was in the will to endure, to stand firm, and to never be defeated. And for the first time, Zorath realized that the universe had much more to teach him than he had ever realized. The aftermath of the confrontation left the classroom forever changed. Professor Zorath, the once untouchable master of diplomacy, had been humbled, and the alien students who had once mocked James Carter, the human, now viewed him with newfound respect. Zorath had learned the most important lesson of all, not from his vast intellect or political maneuvering, but from the raw power of human endurance and resilience. James Carter, the human soldier from Earth, a Deathworlder, as the professor had come to understand, had proven that humanity's strength was not confined to intellectual or diplomatic prowess. Humans were not mere creatures of emotion and violence, as many believed. They were survivors, forged by a world where only the strongest could endure, adapt, and thrive. James's silent defiance had shown Zorath and the entire class that sometimes true power lies in quiet strength, the ability to stand firm when the world expects you to fall. As the students filed out of the classroom, there was no laughter, no smug remarks. The whispers were replaced with a quiet acknowledgement of the human's abilities. James had made an impression far greater than any diplomatic speech or academic paper ever could. He had demonstrated that humanity was not just a species to be pitted, but one that could stand proudly alongside the most powerful races in the galaxy. Professor Zorath, still nursing his bruised pride, couldn't help but watch James as he left the room. The human's legacy was not in the words he had spoken, nor in the battle of wits they had fought. It was in the quiet demonstration of strength that had turned the professor's entire belief system upside down. James Carter would be remembered not just as a student, but as a symbol of humanity's indomitable will. His legacy was not one of diplomacy, but of survival and unshakable resolve. And that was something no species in the galaxy could afford to ignore.